The FromSoftware boss weapons tend to be some of the more popular weapons, as well as some of the most powerful too, more so depending on the game. And for today, we are going to go over the top 3 best boss soul weapons for every single game. Now yes, we are specifically going over the boss soul weapons or the remembrance weapons. I'm not going to include every single weapon that does drop off a boss. It's just going to be the ones that you trade in their soul or their remembrance to be able to obtain the weapon. But keep in mind, as always, this is just going to be related to PvE. The Demon Souls boss weapons are extremely good. Compared to all the other Souls games, Demon Souls might be the only game that actually has their boss weapons be consistently some of the best options. Probably just ahead of Elden Ring. Now in the older games, specifically for Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, it was a pretty big pain to try and obtain a boss weapon, being that you had to upgrade a separate weapon and then basically dismantle it and turn it into a boss weapon. And being that you weren't really able to unlock boss weapons until like a third of the way through the playthrough, it kind of made sense that they were really powerful. And there are so many amazing options. The Large Sword of Searching is one of the best regular new game options due to it having really high base damage and insane range. The Morion Blade can set up those low HP builds to break open the entire game, and even the Lava Bow is unironically one of the better weapons in the game, because you can get some very respectable damage at a distance. But when it does come to the top 3 best Demon Souls boss weapons, number 3 I'm going to go with the Northern Regalia. This weapon is a great sword that you do acquire after combining both the Demon Brand and the Soul Brand weapons together. And those weapons are very unique in the fact that they don't scale off a particular stat, and they scale off your character tendency. Whether you're a pure white or pure black tendency will be dependent on how much more damage that you output, and the Northern Regalia can go either way. If you are pure black or pure white, you can get well over 500 AR with a great sword that doesn't actually require you to spec in any additional damaging stats. You can just go all into health and stamina and get very respectable damage. The second best boss soul weapon in Demon Souls, in my opinion, is going to be the Blue Blood Sword. You can make a case for this weapon being the best in the entire game. It does get scalings in pretty much every single stat, including luck, which is very unique. So being that it has scalings in all these stats, you can get very high damage at these higher levels. And also it is a straight sword, which is one of the better weapon types in Demon Souls, due to them having very fast movesets and nice variation of moveset. But the thing that makes this weapon be incredibly broken is that you can buff it. So you can go all into magic, gain some damage from the weapon itself, and also be able to use weapon buffs to just further enhance the damage to make it have the best DPS in the entire game. But the number 1 best weapon, in my opinion, is obviously going to go to the Meat Cleaver, which is a very interesting weapon. It's a great hammer that gets slashing damage. It also does have a pretty large sweet spot, so when paired alongside the Master's Ring, it can output some nice damage, but it can potentially output some broken amounts of damage if you just spec into lots of strength, dexterity, and faith, because it gets an S scaling in strength and dexterity and an A scaling in faith, which at these higher levels, it's going to be outputting more damage than anything else, and for some reason, you can buff it too. So you can slap on things like Curse Blade, and that, yeah, the damage is just silly. It is going to be on the slower end, and in Demon Souls there are no like weapons that have hyper armor, so it can be a bit challenging to use. But the damage, the rolling AoE attack, the fact that you can buff it, it just makes it be the best boss weapon. Now Dark Souls 1 is a game that has a very similar boss soul weapon system to Demon Souls, in that you have to upgrade a weapon and then trade it in for a boss weapon. And you can't really unlock boss weapons until halfway through the game. So you might be thinking, okay, if it's going to be such a pain in the ass to try and acquire these boss weapons, you'd think that'd be really good. But no, Dark Souls 1 definitely has the weakest selection of boss weapons in the entire series. Almost every single one of them is either terrible, very mid, or even if they are good, they're still somewhat outclassed. Which for the third best boss soul weapon, in my opinion, is going to go to the Chaos Blade, which it is a decent damaging katana, does have some nice range. I'm not really too big of a fan on the heavy attack, but what's unique about the Chaos Blade is that it does also scale off humanity. So when you have at least 10 humanity on hand, it can output more damage than all the other katanas with a dexterity build. Now the trade-off for this is that you do take self-damage for every single time you land an attack, and also you cannot buff it. Which if you compare this to the other katanas that can be buffed, those are always going to end up outputting more damage at these higher levels, and also doesn't require you to stay at 10 humanity just to be able to get that good damage. But if you don't care about buffs and you are confident in your abilities to stay alive, then the Chaos Blade is a very solid pick. Number 2, we are going to go with the Life Hunt Scythe, which is honestly a fantastic weapon, but the only reason why I don't really recommend it as much is because I think it's just directly outclassed by the Great Scythe. There is no scythe weapon category in this game, all of them did fall under halberds, And halberds are probably the best weapon type in this game because they get amazing reach, nice sweet spot damage, pretty decently fast movesets, and for the scythes in particular, they get a really nice running attack and a solid heavy attack. So in my opinion, it just makes them be like the best weapons in the entire game. And the Scythe can actually output more bleed damage than the Great Scythe, but the reason why I'm not going to value it more so than the Great Scythe is because it's heavier, you cannot buff it, therefore it's not going to get as high a damage as the Great Scythe, it's not going to have as much range, it has higher requirements, and it also does do self-inflicted bleed damage, so every single time you land an attack, it does do a bunch of bleed, which in PvE, for as many enemies that you're fighting, even if you do have the blood shield and the blood bite ring, it can still be a threat, especially because it does do half of your health bar in terms of bleed damage. Like, it's still a fantastic weapon overall, but I'm just not going to really value it over the Great Scythe that you can literally acquire at the beginning of the game. But the best boss soul weapon, in my opinion, is going to be the Quelaag's Fury Sword. Now, just like all the other boss soul weapons I talked about for Dark Souls 1, this one I do consider to be outclassed by other curved swords. Because all the curved swords that you can buff, like the Falchion and the Painted Guardian sword, they're actually going to output higher damage and probably get things like bleed too. But one thing that the Quelaag's does do is have insane amounts of range. Now the movesets are going to be a bit slower in return, but it's not really that noticeable, but the range difference definitely is. And if you don't really care to run buffs, the Quelaag's Fury Sword can be an amazing option because just like the Chaos Blade, the more humanity that you have, the more damage that you can output. So yeah, it's just a very solid weapon overall. It's in one of the best weapon categories in the game. It looks really cool and it performs very well. The Dark Souls 2 boss weapons are plentiful. There are lots and lots of bosses in this game, therefore there are lots and lots of weapons. Some bosses actually house multiple different weapon options. And there are so many good options that I do want to talk about, but I'm not going to really have the time for this video. Maybe we'll end up making an all boss weapon ranking list for Dark Souls 2. But there's some amazing Ultra Greatsword options like the Smelter Sword, the Lost Sinner Ultra Greatsword, some really good dark options too in the Crypt Black Sword and the Roaring Halberd, and some other DLC weapons like the Bewitched Alone Sword and the Ivory King Ultra Greatsword. Might not be the easiest weapons to use, but they do have very high ceilings. But when it does come to the third best boss weapon in Dark Souls 2, I'm going to give it to the King's Ultra Greatsword. I think this is the best Ultra Greatsword in the entire game. Also one of the best strength weapons too, not only because it does consistently output the most amount of damage in its weapon class with basically every single infusion except for Dark, but it also does get the highest poise damage in class, does get respectable counter damage, does get the same moveset as the Great Axes, which I'm typically going to prefer over the Ultra Greatswords because they get nice horizontal swipes, which is typically better for ganks. But it also does get striking damage, which is the best damage type in Dark Souls 2 because pretty much everything is weaker to it. Like, this weapon pretty much ticks every single box. Like, the only downside is going to be the requirements, the weight, and how late you get it into the game. But as soon as you gain access to it, you should definitely use it. The second best boss weapon is going to go to the Chaos Blade, to what I consider the best katana in the entire game. It does consistently get the most damage compared to every katana, does get very respectable range, does get the same poise damage as all the other katanas, but for some reason it gets 160 counter damage, which is just silly. Like, this weapon already outputs amazing damage and has really fast movesets. 160 counter damage is just broken, but the only reason why I'm not going to put this at number 1 is because just like all the other Chaos Blades, it does drain your health for every single time that you land an attack, so it might not be the most beginner-friendly weapon, but it still is amazing. But when it comes to the best boss weapon in Dark Souls 2, I'm going to give it to the Warped Sword. Now, typically curved swords in Dark Souls 2 I do not care for, because they tend to just be like worse katanas, in that they just offer less DPS, lower counter damage, not as good poise damage, and does not have that good variation of moveset. But the Warped Sword does get very good damage for its weapon type, also does have the highest counter damage in class at 130, and gets 25 poise damage. And just like all quicker and lighter weapons in Dark Souls 2, they're going to have a lower stamina cost, which is much more preferred in this game, makes it very beginner friendly. And you can get it much earlier on compared to a lot of the other good boss weapons in this game. The Dark Souls 3 boss weapon list is also pretty solid. They has lots of really cool and flashy types of weapons, some of which are just completely useless, but others are really good. Things like the Demon Scar and the Frida's Great Scythe are some of the more fun weapons that FromSoftware has ever made. The Vort's Great Hammer is like one of the best strength weapons in the entire game, although I do consider some other great hammers to just directly outclass it. But when it does come to the third best boss weapon, I'm going to give it to the Frayed Blade, which I talked about this weapon at length in my katana video, so I'm not going to really talk about it too much, but it is a very decent damaging dexterity katana, does get tied for the most bleed buildup in class, and also has some of the lowest stamina cost on its light attacks. But what makes the weapon amazing is its weapon skill that does have the option of a flurry attack or like a short range projectile, both outputting amazing damage, but the flurry attack is what makes this weapon broken because you can continuously spam it over and over and output amazing damage and really good bleed buildup. Like any single enemy or boss that you fight that you can bleed, this is honestly one of the best weapons to use. The second best boss weapon I'm going to give to the Hollow Slayer Greatsword. Now this is a greatsword that does have a very solid moveset, does get that nice light attack combo that has a mix up of vertical and horizontal swipes, also does get the poking heavy attack, so pretty much is the flawless greatsword moveset. Now does this have the regular skill and stance, which is pretty much like all the other greatswords, and in Dark Souls 3, if your main weapon skill doesn't really do anything too flashy, then you're pretty much always better off going with the infusible options, because the infusible options can be buffed and just output more damage. But what makes the Hollow Slayer's Greatsword really good is that it does do bonus damage to hollowed enemies, which is pretty much like 90% of the entire game. Like there are so many enemies that are classified as hollows that this weapon will just end up doing bonus damage to. And also you just don't have to worry about buffs either. Like it's just super consistent. But the number one spot is going to go to the Dragon Slayer's Great Axe, which is a very high damaging strength and faith based weapon. It might not output as much damage as things like the regular Great Axe with some buffs, but this weapon's damage is going to come very close while having an insanely high damaging skill in Falling Bolt. Any single time that you're struggling with an enemy, you can just click this button. It's a short range, high damaging attack. You get good hyper armor and it just flattens enemies to the ground and just destroys everything. The Great Axe moveset might not be the most forgiving thing in the entire game, but as long as you just spec into a little bit of poise, gain some hyper armor, and trade out with a lot of different enemies, you're definitely going to see the power of this weapon. Now, Bloodborne doesn't technically have any boss soul weapons, because bosses don't really drop their soul that you can be able to trade into anything else. But for the sake of adding Bloodborne to the video, we might as well loosen the criteria just a little bit and have it extend to weapons that the bosses actually use, which there's only really like 4 weapons in this game that the bosses themselves do use, or you can like directly get it off a boss. And thankfully, 3 of them are really good and definitely worth talking about. The third spot's going to go to the Burial Blade, which this weapon is kind of like a curved sword and a scythe in one. The curved sword version of the weapon is nothing too flashy. You only really want to use this if you want to be able to parry enemies or like gain access to a fast charged heavy attack or just get some really quick light attacks, but the DPS is never going to be anything that high. But the transformed version is definitely where it's at because it gains some very nice range. The weapon like over swings, so it's definitely good at hitting multiple enemies at once, especially with that heavy attack that can send enemies flying. But that heavy attack can be a downside because it is very slow and it's very hard to line up a backstab with this type of weapon. I really wish it actually had the really cool double swiping heavy attack like what Gurman has, so kind of a missed opportunity. But the damage is still decent. The rally potential for this weapon is really high as well. Like the only other downside I can think of is that you cannot buff it because it does come with like a split arcane scaling, which might mean that it does have some synergy with an arcane build if you want to use the correct blood gems, but you can't really add some bonus damage on top of this thing. The number 2 spot is going to go to the Holy Moonlight Sword. This could easily get like the number 1 spot as well, like it's literally that good, one of the best weapons in the entire game. It is a strength and arcane based weapon because the untransformed state pretty much performs like a strength weapon, and the transform state is pretty much a pure arcane weapon. So for the most part, when you are building around this thing, you're only going into one or the other, unless you are at these like really high levels with some nourishing gems. Now you might ask the question, which version is actually better? The strength greatsword or the arcane moonlight sword? And honestly, you can go either way. Like both are amazing for different reasons. The greatsword version can honestly output some more consistent damage against a lot of enemies because that poking heavy attack can come out really fast when you have it uncharged, and when spec'd into some thrusting based gems, the damage can be ridiculous. And also it allows you to one-hand the weapon so you can still use your gun. Whereas if you do have the weapon transformed, you are going to have it two-handed, and it is mainly going to be doing arcane damage, which are a handful of bosses that are very resist to arcane, so it might not be the best thing. But the weapon does have its heavy attacks do these really cool projectiles that do cost some blood bullets, but they can output amazing damage, and being able to do decent damage at a distance can just trivialize a lot of different encounters and a lot of different bosses. But at number 1, I am going to go with the Rikuyo, which you technically don't get it off a boss, but Lady Maria literally uses it and you get it in the area directly afterwards. So I might as well include it onto the list, especially because that it is one of the best skill weapons in the game and outputs insane amounts of DPS. You can actually make different types of builds for the both transformed and untransformed version, but having like the cool power stancing or dual wielding form is going to be where I think it shines the most, because having it in this state and spamming the L2 button can just make it do ridiculous damage. It can build up the beast hood pretty quickly. You can also buff the weapon too, and it's just going to melt and stun lock everything in the game. But as for Elden Ring, there is such a massive and giant list of boss weapons, and lots of them are some of the best weapons in the game. Some of them are entirely mid, but there's definitely a lot more powerful options out there. Some honorable mentions before I get into the top 3. Morgoth's Curse Sword is a fantastic dexterity arcane weapon. It's a curved greatsword that has the most range in class, but it also is the lightest, with lots of bleed buildup and a very high damaging skill. Might be a bit more on the expensive end, but it definitely is an S tier option. The Elden Beast Remembrance has 2 insanely good weapons in the Maracas Hammer and the Sacred Relic Sword, and as much as I want to put the Maracas Hammer in the top 3, I really can't, despite it being an amazing strength faith weapon. With a very easy to use skill that outputs lots of stance damage, the Sacred Relic Sword is the best crowd control weapon in the entire game. You're going to sit at the back of the map and just clean out an entire room full of enemies. It just makes like 90% of the game be complete easy mode. But as good as those weapons are, there are going to be 3 that I consider better. The third one being the Mogwin's Sacred Spear. This is one of many amazing strength arcane weapons. It's a great spear that does get the most range in class and some of the most damage, especially when you do use its skill. That does this insane blood damaging AoE that scales purely off arcane and does pure fire damage. It stun locks everything around you, destroys them really quickly. It can also just melt a whole bunch of bosses too. Although the downside of this weapon skill is that it is going to have a longer animation, and some bosses that don't give you longer openings, you're not going to really cheese them as well, but you still at least have a great spear that has amazing range and amazing damage. The power stancing great spear moveset is incredible. Having it with a shield and a guard countering build is really good. And also you can just throw out a spirit summon to distract and then spam the skill the entire time if you wanted to go that route. But either way, with summons or without, it still is deserving of a very high S tier. The second best boss weapon, in my opinion, is going to go to the Sword Lance, which is the single best L2 stick in the entire game. This is a heavy thrusting sword that gets insane damage with a strength build that is to the point that it outdamages things like the Rusted Anchor and the Great Stars. And it's a heavy thrusting sword, meaning that it's going to have a much faster moveset, still get that piercing damage. And there are so many weapon skills that you can pair alongside with this thing that it just makes this be the best pairing. Impaling Thrust, Piercing Fang, Blood Tax, Stormblade, like literally every single one of these Ashes of War just get the most damage with the Sword Lance. And on top of that, this weapon also does get amazing synergy with status effects, because for whatever reason, this just gets bonus amounts of like bleed buildup or frost buildup depending on what status infusion you go with, while also retaining a very good strength scaling. Like the only downside of the weapon is that it is going to have the Great Spear heavy attack, so you do lose out on that really good running heavy attack that the heavy thrusting sword gets, but this also extends to the guard counters, and the Great Spear guard counters are actually a lot better than the heavy thrusting sword guard counters. So it actually makes this be one of the best deflecting weapons too. But yeah, number 1, the Blasphemous Blade. I've talked about it thousands of times. We're going to talk about it again. Strength faith-based weapon. Insane damage. You get health on every single kill just by having it in your hand. You don't even have to use it. And its weapon skill is stupid. It goes very far, does insane damage, goes through enemies, staggers them very well. You get hyper armor with it, and you get health regen too. It's a dumb weapon that makes the game very much easy mode. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the video. I didn't talk about NIGHTREIGN because technically there's no like boss soul weapons in NIGHTREIGN, even though like the boss weapons in Elden Ring are over there as well. And if I were to pick the best remembrance weapon that is in NIGHTREIGN, it probably would go to the Mogwin Sacred Spear. I actually made an entire video ranking all the legendary weapons, so you can go check that out if you wanted to. But it would have been really cool if they actually had the Knights Lord bosses drop their own weapons. Like after you had like a Libra raid and you killed the boss, there was actually like a small chance that it also drops its own weapon too. That would have been sick, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. But that is going to conclude the video. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. And please definitely do like and subscribe. Anyway, catch you guys in the next. See yous.